with that said, I am very, very excited to actually be introducing our next speaker. I'm excited to be introducing her for a couple of reasons. Number one, she's someone who I used to call a colleague, and that is a good thing. She's actually still at this organization. We used to work together. We've worked investigations together, and I've had the privilege of being on the phone with very, very important people asking very demanding questions, and being able to say, my colleague Mary here has the answer to that. And that was a good highlight of my career for a period of time. Mary's also someone who, interestingly enough, I keep running into at interesting locations. So I ran into Mary at a conference in Arizona last year. We run into a lot of SANS events and that kind of stuff. And then there's just times where things pop up and I'll be like, I think that's Mary, and we'll end up saying hey and seeing what's going on. So it's one of those awesome SANS folks who I have the wonderful privilege of calling a friend, calling a colleague, having done work with, and I also have to add in that when it comes to research, Mary is by far a very, very formidable force. She does not let any topic of interest go unresearched, unfounded, and undocumented. And some of Mary's blog posts, which I highly recommend a lot of you check out, and this is kind of setting the stage for what I'm expecting from today's talk, are just so in-depth and informative that you walk away from that being like, I didn't expect to learn this much, but oh my gosh, I need to go and research like this person does. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and Mary, I'm going to go ahead and get you started. Feel free to take as much time as you'd like. No worries. We do have a break schedule right after this. So if you run a little bit over, we've got room. If you finish right on time, that's fine. Not a problem at all. But without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, WinSCP, yeah, you know me. I wanted to be careful about how excited I got about this title because I really wanted to, you know, shout it out in the way it should be pronounced. Mary DeGrazia from Another Forensics Blog. Mary, glad to have you here.
Thank you so much, Matt. And today I am so excited to be talking about WinSCP, yeah, you know me. And today we're going to go ahead and do this in the theme of the 90s, right? 2020 has been crazy. So I just kind of wanted to look back onto a fonder time in my life, the 90s. And yes, the 90s. Who doesn't love the 90s? So one of these pictures is me. I'm looking at my hallway now. So if you have an idea, or you think you might know which one of these permed 90s is me, take a guess and I will let you know. A little bit of background information about myself. I'm an associate managing director at Kroll Cybersecurity, and there I work a lot of digital forensics and incident response cases. I've been in the IT industry now for about 20 years and then specializing in deeper for about the last 10. I'm also a SANS instructor where I get to teach Windows forensic analysis. So I see we have ones. Okay, guess what? I'm actually number 2. That was my prom picture, just totally rocking the 90s hair. Number 1, I have no idea who that is. Random person on the internet when you Google, 90s permed hair. And number 3, this is actually someone from one of my favorite movies, Legally Blonde. Okay, so moving on into WinSCP. So when we think about networks getting compromised and attackers moving throughout the environment, what we see a lot of times is the usage of RDP. So with RDP, we get a lot of really cool artifacts. We get event log entries, the terminal services local session manager event log IDs, like 21 letting us know there was a login. We get the 4624 entries type 10. When we think about lateral movement in the environment and we want to know what an attacker has done, what folders have they accessed? Where have they traversed throughout the environment? We have artifacts like shell banks. Shell banks can show us, what they may have accessed while they were on that system. We can get things like link files and jump lists. All these things go towards helping us determine lateral movements. So any guesses on what movie this is from? I think it's a little bit before the 90s, but I just felt like, we had to give a shout out to this. One of the reasons I really like this scene in war games is they actually kind of get in through this obscure backdoor, and it's not actually right to the main system. It's like this old system they kind of forgot about, and I'm like, wow. watching this many, many years later, I'm like, that actually rings really true to home. The same techniques they were using, back in the 80s is still something that we see today, which I thought was kind of cool. So, but we're not talking about RDP today. We are talking about WinSCP. So with WinSCP, I'm going to focus on the portable version of WinSCP. Now, if you go to the download page for WinSCP, the first program you're going to encounter is, the Windows Installer. With the Windows Installer, we get some registry entries where it stores information. But what we're seeing at Kroll and what I'm seeing in my investigations is WinSCP Portable. So with the portable version, they just download a zip file and everything is unzipped and it's contained right there. So it's not making entries in, the typical program files directory. It's not storing its entries in the registry. It's in a different location, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So what is WinSCP? How is it different than RDP? So WinSCP uses SSH to make the connections, okay? And when it does this, it gives a little bit of a different interface. When we think about RDP, you're logging in to essentially the user's desktop, you're presented their desktop, what it looks like, and interacting with it, and just like you're almost sitting down in front of the computer. Well, WinSCP gives the attacker an ability to browse folders on a remote system. Now, this remote system can be one that's inside the network, or it could be one that is external. So we have two different tracks that we're going here. When we think about an attacker connecting externally, this is going to be where we start thinking about data exfiltration. When we think about internally, we start to think about lateral movement within the environment, very similar to RDP. Some things that they can do with WinSCP might surprise you too. Right here we have a find files. So they can actually use WinSCP to run searches. Now, traditionally, if we think about an attacker using RDP to run searches, they'll be using the Windows interface to do this. So we get entries like the word wheel query, where we can see what searches they've run. But if they start running their searches through WinSCP, we lose that visibility because they're outside of that Windows framework, if you will. They also have the ability to download files. So right here, if they find a folder they like, they can download that onto the host system, or they can go the other way. So exfiltration, they can take data from that system and pass it on out to an external system. So now we start thinking they're using WinSCP. They're not interacting with the Windows Explorer shell, which means we lose shell bags. We also lose that 4624 event ID 10 because they're not connecting in through RDP and the local session manager as well. We're losing those terminal services entries. So now we think about this mechanism where the attackers can move laterally throughout the environment using WinSCP. So you might be thinking, hey, well, with RDP, the reason why they're using RDP is because it's built in natively to the Windows operating system. But with WinSCP, now they have to set up a client to receive those connections. And guess what? Starting with Windows 10, we now have basically an SSH client that can be installed on the system with one simple PowerShell command line. So when we work our cases, and especially when we talk about ransomware cases, we see something that attackers are using called, and I like to call them prepper scripts. They can be PowerShell scripts, they can be batch files, but basically they kind of get the environment ready to push out ransomware. And one of the things that these prepper scripts do, so the update was Windows 10 1809, which I believe was the fall edition when this was pushed out. So with this version, basically you can run this PowerShell command and boom, you get an open SSH server. And what this can be done now instead in these prepper scripts, instead of pushing out or opening up RDP and enabling the firewall rule. And now you can just use the PowerShell command and you can instantly install this SSH server. There are two things in the background that Windows does when you install it this way. One, it automatically does the firewall rule. Two, it automatically adds in an open SSH user. So this makes it relatively easy to set up an SSH client within the environment, very similar to how we've seen RDP in the past. Once that's been done, they just start up the service, and bonus points if they want to throw in, to set service and have it start up automatically. So, it can survive the reboot. So, one line to get that client installed and a couple more to start it up, and then additional one for persistent mechanisms. So, if an attacker has compromised the network, this is pretty trivial for them to kind of prep the environment and get it ready to begin using something like WinSCP to start traversing throughout and doing that lateral movement within the environment. Okay, so, who remembers this guy, right? Who is this? Max something, I think. So here we have Max. He's our attacker, and now that he's got WinSCP, yay, he can move laterally throughout the environment using WinSCP and possibly fly underneath the radar for threat hunters that might be looking for lateral movement via RDP. So now our attacker can move laterally. They've got this set up. But what can we find associated with WinSCP? What kind of artifacts as threat hunters are we going to have a visibility into? And I'll be going into each one of these during this presentation. Okay, one, we can get a byte count of data transferred, which is really cool. With the newer operating systems, there's this artifact called the SHRM, and the SHRM records network activity. So now we can actually get a byte count in between these two systems, data that's transferred back and forth, which can give us some visibility into possibly how much data has been transferred. We're going to get systems connected to, remote directories access, change directory history, which is really cool. We can actually see folders that have been traversed through. So when we start thinking that we've lost this visibility with shellbakes, we can get some of this by some logging that occurs with WinSCP. We can see the user account that was used for the connection. So now when we think about our threat hunting, we will know, okay, this account has been compromised. We need to go take a look at the activity associated with this account and see where else within the environment it has logged into so that we can know where we need to expand our scope. We can see the last folder open. We'll talk about some event log entries that can be used to hunt for. And we also get things like the last execution date, first execution date. This will give us an idea of the time frame that WinSCP was being utilized. Were they using this for a day? Were they using this for a week? Or have they been in the environment, for 6 months doing whatever they want? And then we might be able to get some visibility on the files copied. There is no log per se of files copied, but there are some artifacts that you can kind of use to make this determination, although that one, not my favorite artifact to rely on. All right, so the usual suspects, when we about program execution, you're going to have your normal things. You have your prefetch file indicating ran, your user list, your created and your modified data. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about those. What I'm really going to focus on is the star of the show, the WinSCP.ini file. Okay. So with the WinSCP.ini file, one of the coolest artifacts that we're going to find is called the CD cache. Now the WinSCP.ini file is just a plain text file, and each in it has a header that has a bracket on each side. So the first one we're going to take a look at is the configuration CD cache. This will contain the username that is used to connect into the system, as well as the IP address. So by looking at this WinSCP.ini file, we can immediately get visibility into what accounts have been compromised and what other systems we need to take a look at to see where we need to expand the scope. What other systems have they connected to? Did they connect into that finance system that has, all of the W-2s on it and the HR information. We see that so many times in ransomware cases. They pull this information back, and they want to use that. If you're able to restore from your backups, well, now they're going to blackmail you because they have all of this personal information. So we really want to get an idea of what systems they have connected to, and this includes possibly an external system. So we might be able to make a determination or be aware of the fact that there was exfiltration that happened. So an example of what this looks like is right here. So here we have the account IT support, and it was used to connect into this IP address. This hex right here is what makes up the CD cache. So you can use something like CyberChef or whatever is your favorite programming tool to convert that. And once you convert it, you get basically a little MRU of directories that have been traversed into using the CD or the change directory command. So right here you can see the attacker was on one system, and they were browsing folders on another system and looking for some secret information. This can also, if they are accessing their system outside of the network, so you can see some really interesting things. We might get ability into staging folders where they've exfiltrated out data onto their remote systems. In fact, I was working a case once where we actually saw, another company's name here than the client that we currently had. So this kind of gave indication that this attacker was using an external system not to exfiltrate our client's data, but another company as well, because we did not recognize the name at all. Okay, so moving on from the CD cache, we have the configuration interface commander local panel. This will contain the last path browsed to on the host machine, but it does not indicate that anything was saved there. So this is basically the next time a user starts WinSCP, it's going to remember that was the directory that they were working with, so that they keep on browsing through folders. When I use WinSCP to connect into my Raspberry Pi, I tend to keep like all my Python scripts in one directory, and then I use them to transfer back and forth. It's really nice because I don't have to sit there and click through and browse through all my directories. So this is basically what, oh my goodness, someone just posted a picture of a CD case, right? Okay. This is great. I think I moved last year, or no, 2 years ago, and I actually went through and I had to clean out all my CDs. I was like, really, am I really going to use that old copy of Windows 98 for something? Funny story, I actually did when I first started my career. I had to load up a Windows 98, and I put the CD in, and it spun up and it shattered into like a million pieces. I don't know what happened, if the CD was old or if it was unbalanced, but all of a sudden I heard this like, bam, what was that? And my CD was in a million pieces. It was so old. So I figured I should throw them all out. Okay, so this is our local panel. That can give us some visibility onto the host machine, what they may have been doing on it. So in this particular example with the local panel, we have a directory here called recon tools. So in this particular instance, what the attacker has done is actually they're working on the host machine with the WinSCP. They have some staging tools there. And as they're doing their lateral movement with WinSCP in the environment, they're pulling their tools from their host machine and they're putting them on the remote machine that they're connecting into. So in this .ini file, after they leave and after they're done, they may delete this recon tools folder. So we may not have known it was there, but by looking at the .ini file, we might find evidence of that, which is really cool. And then the other way, we think, lateral movement, moving around within the environment, it can also be related to exfiltration. They might have names of systems there that they were pulling data back to organize all of their data with. Okay, so another really cool one, the local target, configuration history local target. Now this one, it is only created if a file or folder is saved on the host. So when we start thinking about this, this is where we think about staging for exfiltration. So up to this point in time, we have evidence that they've browsed at certain locations on systems. But if they actually take a file and they save it back, now we're going to get this local target. So this is kind of our evidence that, okay, there's something more going on than just browsing. They're pulling back data from systems. They could be staging it for exfiltration, or vice versa. This might be evidence that they're bringing in tools from an external server and saving them on the system. Okay, moving on, this is an example of what this looks like. Now, what's kind of interesting, did some testing on this, and the results were kind of mixed. It may only capture the first session information. So it might only capture the first time that they've been saving files. This is one of those artifacts where I just couldn't really find some consistency with it. I need to go back, I need to do some more testing and figure out why things happened a certain way. But, at least it's something, right, that we can work with here. So this is going to be underneath your configuration history, local target, and just some examples, of some folders and files that were saved here. Okay, so remote target, configuration history, remote target. Files were uploaded to this directory from the host machine to the remote system. So going the other way now, once again, may only capture the first session copy information. Here we get an MRU list, so 0 is going to be the most recent. So what's kind of fun about this is, you kind of start getting visibility into what the attacker remote might look like, right? If I see something like a root here, this is a good chance that this is a Linux system that they might be using. And then once again, I might get visibility by looking at these remote targets, what systems they've compromised in the environment. They might have domain controller 1 there, domain controller 2, file share 1, file share 2. So in the remote target, I can check this variable, and that will give me some ideas of, what they've compromised. So once again, when we start talking about evidence of exfiltration, which is always one of those things that can be really hard to prove definitively, this helps to give us pieces of that puzzle to put together and say, I'm seeing WinSCP being used, I'm seeing a remote target access. I can see the attacker, accessing a remote machine. I can see that they access these 10 machines in the network, and these are all the folders that they visited. Kind of starts to paint a grim picture, right? But, it can help answer some of these questions that we may have lost visibility into earlier. Okay, so the configuration history mask. Now, I talked earlier about the ability of the attacker to search for files within the systems. So they can use, this file mask to do it. Maybe they're looking for some interesting, files named SSN or W2. And believe it or not, people call password files password. So that's a really common one right there, is to see searches ran for password. So this is stored in the .ini file. So this is kind of equivalent to our word will query, right? We can see the keywords that were used to run searches, which once again is really cool. We kind of get this peek into, what was their intent when they were in the environment? Were they just looking for passwords, or are they looking for financial data? Are they looking for very specific intellectual property? What kind of information are we going to find here that they could be searching for? Another interesting thing is, and it's not something I really dive into here, but using WinSCP, you can actually double click on and edit a file. So a lot of times I use it just if I want to do something quick, instead of logging into like PuTTY and running Nano and editing a file, I can do it right through WinSCP for a simple text file. Now, it doesn't have a complex viewer, like for Word documents and PDF files, but it's great just to quickly view text files. So that's just something else to be aware of. After they run a find, they could double click on a text file, open it up, and take a view of it, right? So excellent. This gives us some visibility, like I said, into intent, motivation, what it is that they can be doing on the network. Okay, so in addition to these file masks that are used, we also have a section that will let us know the location of where these searches were ran. So the configuration history remote directory. So now we have the keywords. We also know some locations where they may have been ran. We can go check those locations to see what it is the attacker may have found when they were running those searches. So when we start thinking legally from the perspective of notification, is this going to require us to notify anybody? Are we going to have to let this employee know that they need to go and change all of their passwords for their, personal accounts, things of that nature? This is going to give us some visibility into folders that the attacker ran the searches on, which is really cool. Here's an example of what this looks like. So obviously, they were running searches here in the HR documents, and then at the root of the documents folder. So I don't know if you've been noticing throughout this presentation, I have been giving another 90s flashback to some usernames: Crash, Override, and Acid Burn. Does anybody recognize what movie those names are from? Hackers, right, Daniel, very good. Hackers movie. That was another movie I went back and watched recently and really enjoyed it. Okay, WinSCP timestamps. So the timestamps of these files are pretty interesting. The WinSCP.ini file actually does not exist in that portable until the first time that you run WinSCP. So when you run WinSCP, it creates this WinSCP.ini file. So that's going to give you your visibility into the first time that WinSCP runs. A lot of times when files are unzipped, we get kind of this wonkiness that happens with timestamps. They will carry over created date, modified date sometimes, and we don't actually know. But because the WinSCP.ini file is not created until the first time it runs, we get some nice visibility into that. The WinSCP.ini is also last modified or updated each time WinSCP closes, because it's saving out all those preferences for the user. So this is great, because if we talk about and we're asked, okay, how long was WinSCP running on the system? How many times did they use it? What kind of data did they access? What kind of systems did they access? Just by this WinSCP folder, we can answer a lot of those questions. So if we take the created date and that modified date, we can then pair that with the prefetch file. And on newer Windows systems with the prefetch file, you're going to get additional timestamps, up to 8 of them in that prefetch. So now if we look at that prefetch, we could possibly get different timestamps that we can go look at on the system that we know the attacker was there and was using WinSCP. Okay, so that is all the default stuff that WinSCP saves, thankfully for us, without even asking the user, right? This WinSCP.ini file is being created in the background. The user kind of has no idea that this is going on. They do, or they are presented when they exit WinSCP with the option to save a workspace. So if the attacker is like, sure, yeah, save my workspace, you're going to have an additional entry in there called sessions with the workspace name. Now, this is the default one. Very highly doubt the attacker is going to be like, yes, save my workplace is the hacking workspace. But if they do, you're going to get lucky. You're going to have some information in there as well: hostname, username, local directory, remote directory, all saved underneath that particular workspace. But the really cool thing is you could get a password too. So if they save their workspace to their external system and a password, you might actually get the password. I have a link here at the bottom. It's cut off on my screen. I hope you can see it, but it actually walks through the process of how you can decode this password. So now you could potentially have an IP address of an external system, or if you're wondering what password was compromised in your environment and what user account, this can give you that visibility there, which is kind of a really fun thing. Okay, so here we're talking about the SHRM database. So this is where we can see the bytes received and the bytes sent while the application was being used. So for bytes received where WinSCP is being ran in the SHRM database, you can pull out, you can see right here, it was the WinSCP application and how many bytes received and bytes sent occurred during these time frames. So just for this example, I had sorted by bytes received. This was the largest that came up to the top. So this is a great place to get visibility into, you know, how much data was it? Was it gigs of data? Was it just, you know, megs of data? What was it? And then on the flip side, we have sent. So on the system that was connected into, and you can see the application here doesn't say WinSCP, but it's a SSH Damien right here that did that related to the system profile. Okay, so now that we kind of have this overview of what is it that we can learn with WinSCP, it is time to hunt. Does anybody recognize what this shot is from right here? Another 90s era movie, a great movie. Predator, yes, I love Predator, one of those great movies. So now that we have an idea of what WinSCP, the artifacts that it leaves behind, we're going to talk about how you can look for this within your environment, how you can hunt for it, how you can be on the lookout for it. So whether you want to just make sure nothing untoward is going on, or if you've already suffered a breach and you want to, you know, find out and figure out what happened. So right here, I have an example of, this is always hard for me to pronounce, Velociraptor. So this is a great EDM solution free that you could push out in your environment. And this is just an example of how you could leverage this particular one to hunt for this WinSCP.ini file. Now, WinSCP.ini, you know, this should be very low fidelity within typical networks. Not a lot, you know, if you have a Windows environment, you're really not going to be seeing a lot of WinSCP usage. This is just not something that typical end users are using, and probably not something admins are using unless they're connecting into a Linux system. So if we search for this WinSCP.ini file, very, you know, the results are going to be very targeted, because not only is it tied to WinSCP, but it's also tied to the portable version, which I mentioned you have to go through these extra steps to download. Most people that use WinSCP are going to be installing it into the programs directory using the installer. So right here, I'm just using the file finder right there that's built into Velociraptor. And I've just said, go ahead and look for WinSCP.ini anywhere on the C drive. And that's going to give me that visibility into locating those systems where WinSCP has been ran as long as that hasn't been deleted. So let's talk about the event logs that you can set triggers for. We do get a 4624, but interestingly enough, it's tied to a login type 5. We also get an account name of SSHD. This number right here, this 1860, appears to be random based on my testing. So, you know, you might need a little bit of regular expression to find this here. Domain virtual users, and then of course this process SSHD.exe. Okay, then the corresponding 4634 as well with that. There is an open SSH log. Okay, so this is probably where you're going to go for your big win. It's going to have an event ID 4, and it's going to say it accepted the password for the account name from an IP address on the port SSH. Now, if you have sysmon configured in your environment, which I highly recommend you do, it's going to tell you that, you know, you have a network connection was detected, and once again give you that source and destination IP for SSH. If they use PowerShell to install it, like I said at the beginning, just that example where they can use one command, you're going to get a 4104 entry that you can hunt for, which is the installation of that, and then the corresponding 7040, which is tied to the installation of that service. And a registry key, I'll be talking about that in pretty quickly here. So here's just an example of sysmon, the information that it can give you. Once again, this is logging that is not by default and something that has to be pushed out within the environment, but you get some great information with the sysmon entry. So with the WinSCP installer, you get a bunch of registry keys that are installed. So instead of using the portable now, we're talking about the installer. And basically, you're going to find the same information, but underneath this key, Martin per. Okay, Martin. So look for Martin right here. I'm not going to try and pronounce that correctly, that last one. So you're going to get this WinSCP key. You can see right here, we got the CD hash. the history. So a lot of the same information. Once again, you can use an EDM solution to hunt for this. We have our NT user, and we're just going to look for this CD cache key right here, and the Martin key, and it's going to have that information right there for us. We can see we've got the root and the IP address. So these are ways, you know, you can use Carbon Black, or whatever tool it is you want in a similar fashion to hunt for these. And what's really nice, like I said, they're low fidelity. You're not going to get a lot of crazy hits that you have to filter through on these. Okay, so that concludes the presentation. It is now time for the Q&A. I will be hanging out in the hallway. I know we're right at the time here. If you have any questions, please feel free to hit me up in the hallway or through Twitter or however else you can find me. Thank you.